We're going to begin with this lady right here, Dr. Skotsky. And ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here speaking before this audience in Missouri. I have spoken before many state legislatures in the past 2 months, and so I have learned how to speak into a stationary microphone so I don't have to wave something in front of me. And this is a talk with a lot of details in it, which I will be very happy to elaborate on, because I'm going to try to hit just the high points of some of the issues that are raised by Common Core. Let me give you first just a brief reminder of why I come before you, or why I've been asked to come before you to speak about these standards. As Mr. Presser indicated, I was on Common Core's validation committee, 2009 to 2010, and was one of the 5 people on that committee that was charged with validating Common Core standards. I was one of the 5 that refused to sign off for various reasons. One, they weren't internationally benchmarked, which they were supposed to be. 2, they were not going to make this country competitive, which was one of the purposes for having national standards. And 3, they were not research-based, which was something they were supposed to be. There were other reasons connected with the English language arts standards, which is my own area of expertise, but I will go into those details later on. Let me also remind the audience who may not know that the idea of national standards began maybe about 25 years ago, actually during the Reagan administration, if not before. The question was raised then by people in the Department of Education at the time: why should this country have 50 different sets of state standards, even though there weren't actually developed sets of state standards at that time? But the idea was perhaps this country would benefit from having more uniformity, more consistency across states. It was just a glimmer in some people's eye. It never went very far until actually during the Clinton administration, when there was a reauthorization of one of the elementary and secondary acts that did suggest that the states begin developing standards, and many of them did. They didn't have to have tests, so that meant that some states didn't bother at that time to develop standards. But there were many states at that time that were beginning, and Massachusetts was one of them. In '93, we had our own Education Reform Act, because I have lived in Massachusetts for many years. And that required not only the development of state standards, but state assessments. This was the legislature that did all of this. This was not from a state board of education or from the governor's office, although all players were participating. But we had possibly the best set of ideas and statutes governing the development of standards for the sake of accountability. That was the big idea, how to get accountability from the schools, because ever since maybe 2 to 3 decades ago, and the Nation at Risk report, which suggested our schools were failing, there were a lot of policymakers and others thinking about what could we do to improve our public schools. And standards at that time seemed like the way to go. And then assessments at the state level based on them. The idea was that it would have to be voluntary, because everybody understood this was at that time, a federal form of government. that idea isn't quite as strong as it used to be, but the idea was that we would have all the states participating in testing their own children, and somehow they would all be coordinated together. Then, more recently, within the past 5 to 10 years, the development of standards at a national level became more prominent after a period of time in the 90s, which was also during the Clinton administration, when major organizations at the national level, history, English, science, and I'm leaving out mathematics, which began in '89, were being developed and were running into buzzsaws, different kinds of buzzsaws, at the national level. And in fact, the national history standards that came out in '94 were considered so bad that the Senate denounced them 99-1. That must be pretty bad in order to denounce something 99-1 by the US Senate. But about 5-7 years ago, the idea developed again. And it was done with trying some attempt to learn some lessons from what had happened before at the national level. So things were done much more secretively, behind the curtain, because all of that outfrontness from before had led to a lot of problems. So that may have been part of the thinking as to why these two organizations, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is basically our state school superintendents and commissioners, were funded by the Gates Foundation to develop some national standards for English and mathematics. But they did it with a new twist. They were going to be called college readiness, college and career readiness standards. Now that immediately should raise a little bit of attention, because if you call high school standards college readiness standards, it implies that where you think most kids are going is to college. This was, of course, never historically the goal of a high school diploma. High school diplomas in this country were for all kids, and you could go to work, go to the military, or you took college courses if you wanted to go to college. These standards were called college readiness standards, and they're always very careful to use those terms together. It's a mouthful, because the idea was that if by grade 11 you could pass a test based on college readiness standards, you could, like on a Monopoly board, go right to go. You could go to your freshman college coursework and get credit for those courses, not remediation, because by definition, you were college ready. Very, very clever, as it turned out. By definition alone, if you passed a test called college readiness, then you went to college if the college accepted you. And that's a different piece of the larger problem that I can't spend a lot of time on today. But you went directly to college, and you were given credit for whatever course would follow up that college readiness test. Now, these standards were developed, and there were some positive attributes that have been used to sell them. Some of them are worthy ones for you to think about, because they're still the reasons why many states adopted them. First, the people who were trying to encourage the adoption by state boards of education, governors, commissioners of education, typically the legislature was bypassed. It went mainly to governors, state boards of education chairs, not necessarily the state board, because I was on the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and we were not told about it. It was just the chair who was, and the commissioner, in a memo of understanding, agreed. One of the selling points was that states could now compare themselves. Missouri could compare itself better to Michigan students or to Mississippi students. How you view that comparison is up to you. Massachusetts was told it could now compare itself to Mississippi students better. What usefulness that would have for Massachusetts teachers, I still don't know, but that was one of the selling points. We were told that there might be lower costs for curriculum materials because you could buy materials at a much larger discount if they were available, particularly technologically oriented materials for a larger area, larger number of students. Third reason was that it would be easier for military children who go from state to state. Again, you have to think about your own state and how many military children you have, how many Army military bases you have, and how much you have of movement around from school to school or from district to district. The most important reason, though, was the next one: equal expectations for all children. Now, this was an important one. There was an attempt to figure out why so many students were ending up so poorly. We had a huge dropout rate, we still do. We have many students who do not graduate from high school with adequate reading or math skills, and the large number of students who go on to college, particularly community colleges, maybe half of them drop out. The numbers vary from year to year, but you have many students who are in remedial courses, particularly for mathematics, at the post-secondary level.